Charles Dickens was not just a great writer but a generally good guy. He was a social critic who advocated for the poor and disadvantaged and lent his time and money to many reformist causes. His private life, however, was awkward to say the least. He liked to present himself as a paragon of Victorian rectitude, but among other things, he not only cheated on his wife but cheated on his wife with her sisters in their marital home. Below are 20 things about that and other lesser-known awkward and dark facts about famous people. The 19th century's greatest writer. Charles Dickens, in full Charles John Huffam Dickens, was the greatest novelist of the Victorian era and one of the most successful writers of all time. A literary genius, he penned 15 novels, 5 novellas, hundreds of short stories and non-fiction articles, and edited a weekly journal for 20 years. Fortune smiled on Dickens, and he enjoyed greater popularity in his lifetime than any other author had until then. His works such as A Christmas Carol, A Tale of Two Cities, Oliver Twist, Great Expectations, and David Copperfield captivated readers of his era and are still widely read today. He was not just a popular novelist, though, but was also a social critic. Born in the middle class, Dickens' father's financial ineptitude flung the family headlong into poverty. When his dad was thrown into debtor's prison, 12-year-old Dickens dropped out of school to work in a boot shine factory. It gave him intimate knowledge of the working class's problems and privations, which came through in his writings. Throughout his life, Dickens strove to present himself as a model of Victorian probity, and all in all he was a good guy. He vigorously advocated for children's rights, education and other social reforms, and spoke out for the poor and marginalized. He was no plaster saint, however, and his biographers have long struggled to reconcile his decent side with some of the more awkward or downright dark aspects of his personality. Charles Dickens' awkward relationship with his sister-in-law. In 1836, after they had been engaged for a year, Charles Dickens married Catherine Thompson Hogarth, the daughter of a newspaper editor. In 1837, Catherine's younger sister, Mary Scott Hogarth, moved into the Dickens household, and her brother-in-law grew quite fond of her. Just how fond has long been cause for speculation and gossip. Dickens' behavior after Mary suddenly died at age 17 of a heart attack or stroke lent credence to allegation of an affair with his wife's sister. He wrote of her as a very dear young relative, and described her as the chief solace of his labors. The great author secured a lock of Mary's hair and wore her ring for the rest of his life. Things must have gotten awkward in the Dickens household, as the author seemed to cherish his dead sister-in-law far more than he did his live wife. After Catherine gave him 10 children, Dickens fell out of love with her and fell head over heels in love with a teenager. In 1857, a 45-year Dickens began an affair with Ellen Ternan, an 18-year-old actress in a play he produced. It lasted for the rest of his life, and was carried out in a house he bought her in the outskirts of London. When his marriage fell apart, Dickens publicly aired his private laundry, and turned his wife's other sister, with whom he also apparently had an affair, against her. Charles Dickens' affair with his other sister-in-law. Charles Dickens' wife Catherine's wife found out about his affair with Ellen Ternan because of a mistake worthy of a romance novel. In 1858 he ordered a bracelet as a present for his teenage lover, but it was accidentally delivered to his house instead. When Catherine accused him of cheating on her, he denied it and claimed that it was his custom to buy gifts for everybody who acted in his plays. She didn't buy it, and the couple legally separated a few weeks later. In an unusual move, Dickens published a notice in newspapers, in which he claimed that it was an amicable split. Dickens was motivated by the need to squelch rumors not only about his relationship with an actress, but about an affair with yet another sister-in-law. In 1842, Catherine's other younger sister, Georgina Hogarth, then 15 years old, moved into the Dickens household. It was widely rumored at the time that the author had an affair with her. When her older sister's marriage fell apart, Georgina sided with Dickens against her own sister, and continued to live in his house until his death in 1870. In his will, Dickens left Georgina far more than he did Catherine, as well as all his private papers. A great children's books author. Danish author Hans Christian Andersen penned numerous plays, poems, novels, travel books and autobiographies. His specialty, however, was literary fairy tales. His works in that genre, which include The Little Mermaid and The Ugly Duckling, have become embedded in Western cultural consciousness. His fairy tales are among the most widely translated writings in history. Indeed, they have been a staple of childhood and brought joy to generations of kids around the world. Which is ironic, because Andersen's own childhood was an unhappy one. Born to impoverished parents, Andersen grew up in dire want, and as a child, his mother sent him to work in a local mill to help make ends meet. The childhood penury was compounded by a childhood homeliness, or ugliness if you will, that got the young Andersen teased, mocked and bullied by his peers. The Ugly Duckling was actually based on his own miserable early years. He overcame the sad childhood and dire poverty, and harnessed those experiences into stories that impacted many. His unhappy early experiences messed him up, however, and contributed to some awkward adult habits. A great author's awkward compulsion. In his free time from writing fairy tales that would go on to feature prominently in the childhood of billions around the planet, Hans Christian Andersen liked to play with himself. He liked to play with himself a whole lot. As in pleasure himself compulsively. When he was not pleasuring himself, he liked to talk with prostitutes, and then rush back home to touch himself. A celibate, which perhaps sheds some light on things. Andersen not only liked to pleasure himself a lot, he also liked to keep meticulous records of his sessions. He described and listed them in his diary with a pair of plus signs. For example, one descriptive entry read, "When they left, I had a doubly sensuous." In Paris, Andersen liked to visit prostitutes and talk with them, then rush back to his hotel to put more sign entries in his diary. He also had a maudlin and needy streak, and repeatedly fell in love with people, both men and women, who did not reciprocate his feelings. He often wrote cloyingly mawkish love letters to the objects of his affection. He frequently penned long and awkward emotional tracts, in which he gushed about his feelings to women, whom he knew were uninterested and would turn him down. In a way, he throve on rejection. Then he would rush back home and earn more entries for his diary. Mozart's awkward butt fixation. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart first performed before royalty at age 5. By the time he died 30 years later, he had cemented his place in history as one of the classical era's most prolific and influential composers. He created about 600 compositions, many of them considered to be the pinnacles of classical music, and impacted subsequent music heavyweights such as Haydn and Beethoven. His legacy is still felt in Western music to this day. For somebody whose star burned so bright before he died so young, it is perhaps no surprise that Mozart was a freak beneath the sheets. Generations of state biographers found it awkward to describe Mozart's fixation with rear ends. Not to put too fine a point on it, he liked to get his butt licked. In 1782 he composed Leck mich im Arsch, a party piece for his friends whose lyrics include telling people to lick him, where the sun doesn't shine, and continues on in that vein. His publisher was scandalized by the lyrics, but he liked the music. So he tinkered, or basically rewrote the lyrics, changed the song's theme and refrain from rear licking to Let Us Be Glad. Mozart also composed Bona Nox, whose lyrics include, "Fee, fee, shit in your bed and make it burst, good night, sleep tight," and then told the audience to put your mouth to your behind. Awkward facts about the lovable tramp. English actor Charlie Chaplin was the silent film era's most famous and beloved star, and one of the silver screen's all-time greats. However, there was a creepy side to him. In addition to being a pioneer who revolutionized acting and comedy, Chaplin was also a pervert who liked him young. So young as to cause scandal, derail his career, and get him de facto deported from the U.S. He was also a Harvey Weinstein type, before there was a Harvey Weinstein. Chaplin reportedly pioneered the casting couch, whereby powerful Hollywood figures extracted explicit favors from actresses during auditions. He used caption cards in auditions to prompt aspiring actresses into increasingly suggestive acts and poses, until they stood before him naked or nearly so. That kind of predation, however, was run-of-the-mill. He had other kinks that went beyond the usual quid pro quo harassment, and into the realm of the unusual. Among other things, Chaplin had a thing for pies, and not just as comedic props and gags. After he got actresses to disrobe amidst their auditions, Chaplin would grope them in exaggerated ways on the couch. Then after he had worked himself up by getting them to do a striptease on demand, followed by a groping session on the couch, he would stand them naked against a wall and throw pies at them. That seemed to do it for him. The lovable tramp's many scandals. Charlie Chaplin also had a penchant for group activities, naked ones. To organize them with his friend and fellow comedic film star, Fatty Arbuckle, who has his own scandalous entry below. Those activities came to an abrupt halt in the aftermath of a scandal that rocked the country in 1921, when Fatty Arbuckle was accused of an assault that led to a woman's death, and was tried for murder. Although acquitted, the Chaplin-Arbuckle parties never resumed. Chaplin's greatest scandals, however, arose from his propensity to rob the cradle. He liked much younger women. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, a pervert himself if ever there was one, had long disliked Chaplin's political leanings, so he used the actor's scandals to launch a smear campaign against him. In 1944, he had Chaplin prosecuted for violations of the Mann Act, which prohibits the transportation of women across state lines for explicit purposes. Chaplin was acquitted, but his reputation was severely damaged. In 1952, while Chaplin was in London for a film premiere, the U.S. Department of Justice revoked his visa. To gain re-entry to the U.S., he would have to submit to an interview about his politics and morality. Chaplin decided not to bother, cut his ties with America, and settled in Switzerland. Charlie Chaplin's Hollywood pal. Charlie Chaplin's BFF in Hollywood used to be Roscoe Conkling Arbuckle, better known as Fatty Arbuckle. He was a comedian, director, screenwriter, and early superstar actor in the silent film era. A heavy man who weighed about 300 pounds, Arbuckle incorporated his heft into his comedy as he moved gracefully, tumbled, threw pies, and behaved as an all-around lovable and jolly fat guy. In addition to being an actor, Arbuckle was a Hollywood mover and shaker. He mentored Charlie Chaplin, with whom he formed a close personal friendship. Arbuckle also discovered and launched the careers of future stars, such as Buster Keaton and Bob Hope. Things got awkward for the Chaplin-Arbuckle friendship, however, when a scandal struck and destroyed Fatty's career and reputation. It began with a wild party at a San Francisco hotel, where Arbuckle and friends rented adjacent luxury suites in September of 1921. Several women were invited, and at some point amidst the revelry, an aspiring actress, Virginia Ripay, was found seriously ill in one of the suites. Newspapers had a field day with this scandal. The hotel's doctor examined Virginia Ripay, concluded that she was incredibly intoxicated, and gave her morphine to calm her down. As it turned out, the situation was more serious. 2 days after the San Francisco hotel party, Ripay was rushed to a hospital. There, a friend claimed that Fatty Arbuckle had assaulted her at the party. The next day, Ripay died of peritonitis, caused by a ruptured bladder. Although medical examinations found no evidence of assault, newspapers nonetheless had a field day. The press, no less restrained in the Roaring Twenties than it is today, printed increasingly salacious stories about Ripay's death and left no awkward angle unexplored. Some alleged that Arbuckle had killed Ripay with his weight when he got on top and assaulted her. Other stories claimed that Fatty had penetrated Ripay with a piece of ice. The ice assault take eventually grew into accusations that Arbuckle had ruptured Ripay's insides when he penetrated her with a bottle of Coca-Cola or champagne. Things got dark for Fatty Arbuckle real quick. Police investigators went with the theory that the heavy impact of the overweight Fatty Arbuckles atop Virginia Ripay during intercourse had caused her bladder to rupture. Arbuckle found himself in an increasingly bad situation and truthfully denied that he had done any wrong. It did him no good, and amidst a public furor whipped by an unscrupulous press and an even more unscrupulous prosecutor, he was arrested and charged with manslaughter. Initially, San Francisco's district attorney had wanted to try Arbuckle on a first-degree murder charge and seek the death penalty. The resultant criminal case was a major media event, the O.J. Simpson scandal of the day. Those who knew Arbuckle regarded him as a good-natured man who was shy. As some put it, he was the most chaste man in pictures. His friend Charlie Chaplin stated that he knew Roscoe as a genial and easygoing man who would not harm a fly. However, after the Ripay scandal erupted, newspapers went with a far different image. The hitherto beloved comic actor was now depicted as a gross pervert who routinely used his massive bulk to overpower and force himself upon innocent girls. Innocence did not save this once beloved actor's career. The criminal case against Fatty Arbuckle fizzled when evidence of prosecutorial misconduct emerged. As it turned out, San Francisco's district attorney, an ambitious man with plans to run for California governor, had pressured witnesses into lying. The defense also obtained an exculpatory letter from the state's star witness, Virginia Ripay's friend, who had first leveled accusations of assault. In it, she admitted that she had planned to extort money from Arbuckle. In the trial, the state produced little credible evidence, and medical experts demonstrated that Ripay's bladder had been ruptured by an internal inflammation, not by an outside force. The jury deadlocked 10-2 in favor of acquittal, and a mistrial was declared. A second trial again ended in a 10-2 deadlock in favor of a not guilty verdict. A third trial was launched, and at its conclusion, the jury took just 6 minutes to return a unanimous verdict of not guilty. Arbuckle was thus exonerated, but his company in Hollywood was now not only awkward but outright toxic. His reputation and standing never recovered, and his career was effectively destroyed. An awkward revelation about a Hollywood heartthrob. Hollywood silent film era superstar Rudolf Valentino, also known as the Latin Lover, was a 1920s symbol of masculinity. He shot to fame with performances in silent film blockbusters such as The Sheik and The Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse. His sudden death at the young age of 31 resulted in mass hysteria among his female fans and solidified his iconic status. However, there was an awkward fact about the beloved actor that had been little known in his lifetime. Before he became a star, Valentino had probably been a male prostitute. He had worked as a dancer in what was known as taxi dance clubs. Such clubs were basically escorting services, where clients would come in, examine the club's stable of dancers, and pay to dance with whichever one caught their eye. Clients who got good vibes and liked their dance partner would negotiate a price with him or her, then pay the club an exit fee to leave with the dancer. Some taxi dance clubs were legitimate and innocent, but most were just straight-up escort services. In Valentino's case, he was once arrested in a brothel before he became famous, so it is unlikely that his taxi dance club was the innocent kind. To put it in perspective, imagine if it was discovered that Brad Pitt had been a gigolo, or male prostitute who had worked for an escort service. The paparazzi stampede would have caused an earthquake. The ensuing media and social media firestorm would probably have broken the internet, as the insatiable demand for salacious details produced a flood of stories. Freud had the hots for his mom. The famous Austrian neurologist Sigmund Freud is widely acknowledged as the father of psychoanalysis and psychotherapy. We have him to thank for the psychiatrist's couch and the payment of hundreds of dollars an hour for somebody to nod his head as he listens to us drone on about our lives. Before prescribing us some happy pills, Freud basically said that we are all perverts, and that deep down, all guys want to murder their fathers in order to clear the path for intercourse with their own mothers. Ironically, the figure he chose to name that complex after was probably the least edible person ever. In Greek mythology, Oedipus went to extreme lengths to avoid a prophecy that predicted he would murder his father and marry his mother. He only ended up doing so unwittingly, after a series of extraordinary flukes. Freud, by contrast, was pretty Oedipal himself, as he openly acknowledged the awkward fact that he had lusted after his mother. That paled in comparison to Freud's theory that the root cause of child molestation was not adults who preyed upon children, but children who lusted after their parents. The Seedy Misadventures of the Prince of Wales. Albert Edward, the eldest son of Queen Victoria and her consort Prince Albert, went on to succeed his mother on the throne and reign as King Edward VII from 1901 until his death. He was no great shakes as a ruler and was a mediocrity both as a man and as a monarch. As a libertine, freak, and all-around royal pervert, however, he shone. He stood in stark contrast to his notoriously straight-laced mother, who lent her name to an uptight and prudish age. As he grew up, Albert, or Bertie, was a disappointment to his prim and proper parents. The first letdown arrived when Bertie was 16 years old and had his first scandal with a prostitute. The Queen was not amused, and the conversation must have been as awkward gets. Bertie did not mend his wayward ways, and after another scandal, his father went to chastise him. On the way back, he caught a severe bout of pneumonia, which did him in. For the next 4 decades, Queen Victoria blamed Bertie for the death of her beloved husband, and actively tried to prevent his succession to the throne. A royal with his own dedicated brothel room. Queen Victoria failed to get her eldest son removed from the line of succession. However, she often remarked that her longevity and long reign were due to her determination to outlive Bertie and prevent him from ever becoming king. She tried hard and did her best, but after a reign that lasted for 64 years, Victoria finally died in 1901. After a long wait that he thought would never end, Bertie became King Edward VII at age 60. In those long decades, Bertie became notorious for his relentless quest to gratify his intimate appetites. Whether cheap hookers, top-notch French aristocratic ladies and courtesans, discreet liaisons, well-publicized affairs with famous actresses, swinger wife swap orgies, Bertie was insatiable and down for it all. He was a big fan of Paris elite brothels, especially its most exclusive house of night, La Chabannes. There he had his own room, decorated with his coat of arms and furnished to his specific taste. Said tastes included a specially designed chair, named Siege d'Amour, which he had installed in his private brothel room. By the 1890s, Bertie was an obese, middle-aged and out-of-shape man, so he had the heavy-duty love chair custom-made to bear much of his weight and enable him to do the deed without crushing his partners. It also positioned his partners just right for royal access, with minimal exertion and contortions on his part. Ireland's greatest writer and his awkward kink. James Augustine Aloysius Joyce is probably Ireland's greatest man of letters. The author of the innovative novels Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake was a modernist writer who wrote in a groundbreaking style. In it he combined complexity with explicit content that shocked contemporaries and led to landmark legal decisions on obscenity. Since creative genius is so often accompanied by odd and awkward behavior, it should perhaps come as no surprise that James Joyce was also a total weirdo. Joyce had a thing for breaking wind farts, if you will. He just loved farts to distraction, and could not get enough of them. Whether he dished them out preferably on people's faces, or received them, farts made Joyce's day. His enjoyment of farts was not limited to the fine pleasure of experiencing them. As a world-class author, he had to write about farts, and describe them in exquisite detail. Indeed, there is an entire collection of Joyce letters, in which he writes passionately about cutting the cheese. A Connoisseur of Farts. To get an idea of James Joyce's awkward fascination with farts, consider this excerpt from a letter to his lover. After talking explicitly about making love to a farting woman, he goes on to say, "I think I would know Nora's fart anywhere. I think I could pick hers out in a room full of farting women. It is a rather girlish noise, not like the wet windy fart, which I imagine fat wives have. It is sudden and dry and dirty, like what a bold girl would let off in fun, in a school dormitory at night. I hope Nora will let off no end of her farts in my face, so that I may know their smell also." For years, Joyce struggled with acute anterior uveitis, an inflammation of his iris. Later he developed glaucoma due to these episodes. Lingering pain left him unable to read or write for weeks. Joyce underwent numerous procedures and surgeries to try and remedy his recurring eye problems. He also suffered acutely from syphilis. But the thing that did him in was the aftereffects of surgery performed on his perforated ulcer. A medieval romance that went seriously awry. Romeo and Juliet are probably the world's best-known star-crossed lovers. However, they are fictional characters, conceived in the imagination of William Shakespeare and brought to life by his quill. For real-life star-crossed lovers, perhaps none are more famous than Eloise and Abellard. A pair of medieval scholars, their romance ended in a painful manner, especially for him as it gets. Peter Abellard was born into minor French nobility in Brittany, and from an early age, he exhibited a love of knowledge that marked him for a life of scholarship. Abelard's father encouraged him to study the liberal arts, and by his early 20s, he was famous for his debate skills, particularly in philosophy. Like some super-smart people, however, he also gained a reputation for arrogance. By 1115, Abelard was an accomplished theologian, the master of Notre Dame, and a canon in the archdiocese that included Paris. That was when he ran into Eloise d'Argenteuil. She lived in the precincts of Notre Dame under the care of her uncle, a secular canon named Fulbert. A torrid and illicit affair. A rarity among women in her day, Eloise had mastered Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and gained renown for her knowledge of classical studies. To get to her, Abelard wormed his way into the household of her uncle Fulbert. He claimed that he could not afford a place of his own, and offered to tutor his niece in lieu of rent. Fulbert agreed. Tutor and student soon hit it off, and in 1115, Eloise and Abelard began an affair. It was torrid, and given their circumstance, the duo were too blinded by their passion to pay heed to the risks involved. Eloise lived in convent, but she snuck out, or he snuck in whenever possible. They got physical whenever and wherever they could. They made love in gardens at night, in her convent cell, in the nunnery's kitchens, and in her uncle and guardian's bedroom. She eventually got pregnant, and the couple found themselves in an awkward situation. So Abelard arranged for her to visit his family in Brittany. There she gave birth to a son. Unfortunately for the lovers, and especially for Abelard, his arrogance betrayed him. He started to boast of his conquest. That backfired on him in a major way.